I have been thinking about my book, Is Marriage for White People, for many years, certainly more than a decade. When I entered law teaching, my first article was actually about race in people's family lives. I wrote an article about race and adoption and the placement of children and whether children should be placed across racial lines or only within their own race. And one of the things that excited me about that topic was that it was a socially significant topic. There are hundreds of thousands of children awaiting adoption. They're disproportionately African American. So it was a socially significant topic, but it was also a topic that is not typically discussed when we talk about race. When we talk about racial issues, we're talking about affirmative action, or we're talking about voting, or we're talking about employment discrimination. And all those issues are discussed so frequently that we all develop very scripted responses. We know how we feel. We know who agrees with us, who disagrees with us. In our own minds, we identify what's the right position and what's the wrong position. Whereas when you talk about the family and the role of race in the family setting and the ways the law regulates that or influences that, we don't talk about it very much, so we don't have very scripted positions. We don't know what to think. So in my first article, I posed the question, should we place black children with white families? And that's the sort of issue that people have conflicted feelings about. And I had conflicted feelings about. So in that article, I had to work out my own thoughts about that. In this book, the question is what to make of the decline in marriage among African Americans.
And is there a big decline?
The African Americans have become, in the last half century, the most unmarried people in the United States by a long shot. Black women are at every educational level much more likely than white women to be unmarried and to never marry. Black women are 3 times as likely as white women to never marry. This is true for the poor, among whom the drop has been especially severe, but it's also the case among the middle class. You know, college-educated black woman who reaches age 40 is more than twice as likely as her white counterpart to have never married. So in the book, I had to sort of make sense of that development. And I had conflicted feelings about it. So I had to make sense of that development. The book also looks a lot at issues of interracial relationships. Black women are also the least likely of any group in the United States, frankly, to marry someone of a different race. So I had to make sense of that and to try to think about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral development. And I mean, I still think the issues are just very difficult, and they arouse conflicting feelings. So what made the project interesting to me was that, again, it was something that was socially significant, but it was also not a project where I had easy answers, where I knew at the beginning of the book what I was going to write and what the argument was. I actually had to discover the argument in the course of writing the book, in the course of doing more research, in the course of talking to people. I discovered what the argument would be. And I hope those same characteristics will make it of interest to others, because the intimate realm is not something that we tend to talk about openly when it comes to race. The racial gap in marriage has developed over time.
Okay.
In 1950, black women were about as likely to be married as white women.
Okay.
So there was very little gap there, which is not to say that the marital experiences were identical, but there wasn't much of a gap. In the 1960s, the gap developed and it's widened since then. And it's also spread from the poor to the middle class and even the upper middle class among African Americans. So there's a racial gap throughout the socioeconomic spectrum. My approach initially was to sort of read all of the research about race and marriage. In the course of teaching family law, of course, one of the major issues in the backdrop of the course is, well, how is the family changing? So I would teach every year about changing family patterns in American society. And what became apparent after a while as I taught about changing family patterns, but also began to do my own research about patterns of marriage for African Americans, was that there was a lot of overlap or continuity between the experiences of African Americans and the experiences of other groups in society. But there hadn't been much discussion about that overlap or that connection. Most of the discussion of marriage focuses on changes throughout society. People want to talk generally about how marriage rates are changing and divorce rates and who's coming together and who's not. So they talk generally about marriage. And then there's a whole separate conversation about race, which mostly focuses on the black poor. So people in inner city Chicago, sort of where the men don't have jobs and the women have children without being married, the underclass. And so there's a literature and a group of scholars who study the underclass, and there's a literature and a group of scholars who study marriage, but those are by and large separate groups of people. They don't go to the same conferences, they don't talk a lot. Most of the books, almost all of the books that had been written, and most of the articles that have been written don't connect the experiences of African Americans on one hand and the general society on the other. So one of the things that I wanted to do here was to try to bring those experiences together through the bridge of the black middle class. So I look at the black middle class and show how the particular experiences of African Americans are in many respects also universal experiences in American society. So how did I research this? I began the research by reading first law review articles, and then social science articles, a lot of history, some psychology. So I canvassed these different fields and read what I thought was the best work in each field about why the marriage decline has been so extreme among African Americans. And I began to write the book then. This is several years ago, many years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago. I began to write the book then. And then I think someone told me, and maybe I realized it myself, that, it's kind of boring because you're talking about this scholar and that scholar and this scholar and that scholar, and it had the feeling of sort of inside baseball. And if one was very interested in the different scholarly approaches to the question of why marriage rates have declined or why marriage has changed and how marriage has changed, then it would have been useful. But if you weren't an academic, it wouldn't be very interesting. And I thought about that, and I decided that it would be better to try to write a book that was interesting as well as informative. So I began to open myself to the possibility of interviewing people. I have a journalistic background, I should say. While I was an undergrad, I worked for the Stanford Daily, and I wrote a column for a daily newspaper years ago, the Peninsula Times-Tribune, which is a local Palo Alto paper when I was finishing undergraduate school. I continued that on into law school. I've written op-eds for a lot of newspapers over time. So I have some journalistic background. I thought, well, maybe it would be cool to go out and interview people. And initially I was thinking that the interviews would illuminate or illustrate the points that I wanted to make based on the empirical data. And I found that was true, but I also found two other things that I had not expected. One was that many people, women in particular, black women who I spoke to, actually wanted to talk because they wanted to tell their story. They felt that their story hadn't been told before. Just as I noted that the scholarly literature didn't focus much on the question of the middle class, the black middle class in marriage, they felt as well that their lives weren't represented in a way in the popular media and weren't represented in all the things that they read about black people on the one hand or about marriage on the other. So there were people who wanted to talk. And as they spoke, and as I began to interview women, just sort of friends and friends of friends and friends of friends of friends, as I began to interview them, I realized that their experiences were a means of illuminating aspects of the social terrain that I had been unaware of based on my more academic research. So the interviews really changed the focus of the book. They didn't simply, I wasn't able to, I didn't use them simply to illustrate points that I had already decided to make. I reshaped the book in response to the interviews, in response to what people told me, because there were aspects of their lives that seemed obviously important to them that I would not have gleaned from the research studies or from census data on my own. One example is that I talked to a lot of black women who are very well educated, who are college graduates, have law degrees or business degrees often, and a number of them wanted to talk about their relationships with blue collar black men. So professional women and working class men. And that issue dominated some of my interviews because it's what was on their mind. And once I heard that story enough times, I went back and I looked at the data, and of course it turned out that women now are more likely than ever to earn more than their husbands and be better educated than their husbands, because women are a majority of college graduates and women are advancing in the job market. And among African Americans, again, that development is most pronounced. There are 2 black women who graduate college every year for each one man. There are nearly twice as many black women who graduate law school each year as black men, twice as many black women who graduate medical school as black men each year. Not quite twice as many, but approaching twice as many. So if women are outnumbering men, African American women are outnumbering men 2 to 1 among the ranks of lawyers, among the ranks of doctors, among the ranks of college graduates, then it figures that many of these women will be married to men who are less educated and who earn less than they do. And that's a hugely important social development. It was not a development that I would have realized the significance of had I not interviewed people and heard them tell stories that reflected that development. It's also not something, frankly, that's been written about very much, in part because most people don't write about the black middle class in marriage. They focus on the society generally. And if you look at the society generally, although women are moving ahead, the numbers are not as stark as they are with African Americans.